Hello and welcome to Working with Miniatures. I'm Jim and today we're going to be painting the Reaper Miniatures Village of Kulhaven Townsfolk 1. We will be using the Army Painter Speed Paints. I'll be using them for the first time and I'm interested in how it's going to turn out. I have seen some negative reviews on them, but I'm sure there's a way to work around it and it may just take a little experimentation. Let's get to it. For cleanup, I use a pair of cheap snippers, an X-Acto knife, and sanding sticks of various grain. I honestly never pay attention to the grain and just grab one out of the pile. I do test it on the bottom of the miniatures before sanding to ensure it's not going to be too rough. The only real notable cleanup that had to be done was on the blacksmith between his upper arm and torso, where I had to cut a huge portion of metal out with the X-Acto knife. I've painted several miniatures using Citadel's color contrast line, and I like the results if I place previous highlights with grays and white. I assume this would have had a similar result with the speed paints, and to be fair it does, though I believe it to be a negative result. I recommend skipping this step, and later I plan to test the speed paints over various primers in a future video. Initially, I primed the miniatures black before adding zenithal highlights with increasingly brighter grays. I think the pre-highlighting can still be beneficial, but I think it needs to be based in gray and then followed by zenithal sprays of lighter white. Moving on to the Army Painter Speed Paints, I start with hardened leather. The figure on the screen is literally my first experience using this type of paint. I can say in all honesty that after using the contrast paints, I'm already liking these. I mean, don't get me wrong, I like the contrast paints also, but these speed paints spread smoother and seem less tacky. To save paint and time, I line up all the miniatures in assembly line fashion. I did no previous planning on what colors I wanted and just grabbed anything I thought should be hardened leather brown. I swapped to pallid bone and went back to the front of the line, again moving through the ranks without any real thought as to what color is going where. The only real rules I was following was to use the speed paints on the clothing at the very least. I swapped to Gravelord Grey for most of the boots. In fact, for all but two miniatures, all the footwear was done with either hardened leather or Gravelord Grey, to simulate the cobbler's limited resources in this small village. I had a little extra Gravelord Grey on my wet palette, so I decided to try it on some hair as well. I tried High Lord Blue on some clothing, and admittedly I was a little shocked at how vibrant it was. As I paint on Zealot Yellow on the little girl's dress, I guess I expected a paler yellow and had trouble distinguishing much difference from the sash that was painted in pallid bone. Because of this, I decided to paint directly over it with Hive Dweller Purple, a complementary color, and found it covered over it without issues. As I transitioned to Blood Red, I realized many of these colors in the starter set are rich and vibrant, perfect for clean clothing, but if you want a grittier, grimdark-esque miniature, I'm not sure how easy that would be to accomplish over these speed paints. Perhaps another video for another day. As I move through the last speed paints, I make my third mistake with Fire Giant Orange when I get in too much of a hurry and get a little of this paint on parts I intended to remain white, the frill of this woman's bonnet and the corner of her apron. I will show this more closely later in the video. With two colors left, I swapped to Orc Skin, which I used to paint the young twins that look remarkably like a young Owen Hart. Rest in peace, Blackheart. Crusader Skin. This is the color I had the worst luck with, but it's likely due to the underlying highlights I made. On the blacksmith, the result was actually good, giving the impression of soot and grime from a hard day's work in front of the anvil and forge, but for the waitress, The primer made her chin look like she had thick stubble of a beard starting, and let's be honest, the end result is like she spent the morning shoveling coal into the roaring heart of a steam engine's furnace. I still had some random parts that needed painting, so at this point I began mixing some of the colors on my wet palette to paint anything that remained, such as the farmer's garden hoe and the beggar's walking stick. I used basic acrylics for the flesh of each miniature save for two. Here's a quick review of each miniature and the speed paint colors I used for them. Here we will quickly review the issues I ran into. On the woman with the broom, I had trouble covering excess speed paint that got on the white of her bonnet and apron. 5 undiluted coats of white later and you still see it. For the bartender, the problems were less with the speed paint and caused more by my pre-highlights, so it's not a ding against the speed paint. The waitress with the steins had the same issue, and even after glazing many coats, you can still see the speed paint underneath it. I got some blood red on the apron of another waitress, and again many coats of undiluted white still kept reactivating. My experience with the speed paints have been mostly positive, and so far it seems that covering the speed paint is easier with darker colors than lighter, which may mean it's harder to remedy some mistakes without having to varnish first. This can be planned around by expecting to paint all the areas with speed paint first, and then varnishing and allowing it to dry before adding additional paint. You can paint carefully and slower, but mistakes will still happen. I also found that if you add any additional speed paint on portions that have already dried, it needs to be in the recesses only to darken those areas, or you're going to have to coat the entire thing again to keep it uniform. With that said, I do not regret this purchase. That's all for today. I hope you learned something or were inspired to start or expand your own collection. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them. If you like the content of this video and would like to see more, please like, share, and subscribe. Until the next time, this is Jim with Working with Miniatures. I am truly grateful for your time, and I bid you a fond farewell. Until the next video.